There she goes again, digging through the dumpster like it owes her something. The storm hadn't even finished draining off the roof when Dara Voss came around the side of Meridian Fields with a milk crate full of dead batteries, stacked against her hip, her boots splashing through runoff still finding its way to the storm drain. Somebody up on the third floor leaned out a window and hollered down that the building already had a superintendent. It didn't need a raccoon. The laughter rolled along the walkway and came back twice, bouncing off brick that hadn't been cleaned since the last owner sold the place. Except she wasn't looking for cans. She never once asked anybody for a can. For 4 months, Dara had been going door to door in that building asking the same flat question. Anything dead? Any battery that wouldn't hold a charge anymore? Any panel cracked in last spring's hail? Any inverter somebody had given up on and shoved to the back of a closet behind the winter coats? She never said what for. She knocked, she hauled it down to the boiler room, she said thank you and left. And the door would close behind her before anybody thought to ask a second question. By the time the second storm of the season rolled through, half the building had decided the super's daughter had finally cracked. That grief had gotten into her the way damp gets into drywall, quiet and total and impossible to point it directly. What none of them knew was that she'd already lost the one person who could have told her whether any of it would work. And she was not about to lose the building too. If you like stories about people who see worth where everybody else sees junk, stay with us to the end. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Renata Voss had been gone 14 months, and to her daughter it felt like the whole building's pulse had gone with her. Dara never said that out loud. She didn't say much of anything out loud, which in a building like Meridian Fields meant other people said it for her, usually wrong, usually louder than the truth deserved. Renata had run that super's office for 26 years by feel, walking the halls at 2 in the morning, because something in her chest told her a breaker was about to go before it went, standing in a stairwell with her hand flat on the wall the way another woman might stand with her hand on a sick child's forehead. She'd known which units ran cold in January before the tenants complained, which outlets sparked if you looked at them wrong, which of the building's 41 doors stuck in humid weather and which ones swelled shut in the cold. Dara was the other half of it. The one with the multimeter and the clipboard, who wrote every fault down in neat columns and waited to be sure before touching anything, who could tell you the exact date a hallway light had started flickering, because she'd logged it, where her mother would have simply known. Now the building needed both jobs done by one person, and neither waited politely for her to catch her breath. She slept in the same twin bed she'd slept in since she was 19, in the super's unit at the back of the ground floor. And some nights she lay there listening to the building settle and swore she could still hear her mother's footsteps on the stairs, 4 flights up and 4 flights back down, checking on nothing in particular the way she always had. There was a thing Dara did that the tenants had started calling strange without ever calling it strange to her face. Not directly. Not where she could answer back. She'd crouch at the breaker panel in the basement, touch 2 fingers flat against the cold metal box, and hold them there a long moment, eyes half closed, feeling for the faintest hum of a circuit running hotter than it should, a vibration so small most people would have needed an instrument to catch it. People who caught her doing it figured grief had gotten into her wiring same as the buildings. That a woman crouched in a basement with her fingers pressed to a metal box had come a little unmoored. What she was actually doing was listening. A grid talks the same way a body does, her mother used to say, and most people just never learn to sit still long enough to feel it. She carried her mother's logbook in her jacket pocket everywhere she went. A battered green 3-ring binder with pages soft at the corners from 20 years of wet hands and coffee rings and the oil off 1,000 different tools. And when a thing needed thinking all the way through, she'd take it out on the basement stairs under the one bare bulb and write. Which line dipped first when the grid stumbled. Which unit's lights flickered a full 10 seconds before a brownout hit anybody else. Which wall stayed warm on a January night for reasons nobody had ever bothered to explain. It steadied her the way some people are steadied by a phone call home, except there was no one left to call, only the book. And the book didn't talk back, but some nights that felt like enough. Meridian Fields had never been much to look at, 41 units stacked over a foundation older than anybody currently living in it, wiring patched and repatched since before Dara was born. Brick gone the color of weak tea from decades of exhaust off the avenue. The whole block's grid had been getting shakier every year. Brownouts a little more frequent, outages lasting a little longer each time the lines went down. The utility company sending crews later and later because there were newer developments across the river that got priority now. 2 hard winters running had already fried half the building's surge protection and left 3 units running on extension cords strung through, always like something out of a different, poorer decade. Then the management company sent its letter, polite and final at once. The kind of letter that uses the word opportunity in a sentence clearly meant to scare you. The kind that tells you the clock has an end and it's closer than you think. It said the building had failed its electrical inspection on 11 separate points and either got a full rewire nobody living there could afford, through their rent, a project that would triple everybody's monthly payment for 18 months running, or had non-essential power cut floor by floor while the owners weighed their options, which everyone in that building understood to mean while the owners waited for the place to get unlivable enough that selling it to a developer looked like a mercy instead of an eviction. Everybody assumed Dara would take the severance they were dangling in a follow-up email nobody had asked for and go find super work somewhere with newer wiring, somewhere her name wasn't already tied to a building on its way out. No husband, no kids, no reason anybody could point to for staying past the point it stopped making sense. That was the story they'd already written for her, and it was tidy, and it let them stop thinking about her. Instead, she started knocking on doors. Every evening after her shift ended, before people had time to throw the day's dead batteries out with the regular trash, Dara went unit to unit with the same question in the same flat, even voice that never seemed to rise or fall by much no matter who answered. Most people said yes without thinking twice about it. It cost them nothing to hand off a busted power bank, a solar garden light gone dim, an inverter that had quit on them 2 winters back and never been thrown out only because nobody got around to it. If it made the supers odd, quiet daughter feel useful, so much the better, somebody else's junk gone by morning and a good deed done besides. And they went back to their dinners and never once wondered what the deed was actually for. A few said no. Something about a woman collecting dead batteries and refusing to say why sat wrong with them. Felt like the kind of thing you'd read about in a headline later, and Dara thanked those people the same easy way she thanked everybody else and moved on to the next door down the hall. She didn't argue a mind already closed. She'd never seen the use in arguing with somebody who'd already decided. The talk started before the crates were even half full, on the stoop where the smokers gathered, in the laundry room over the thump of the dryers, on the church corner 2 blocks down, and loudest of all on the 3rd floor landing where a man named Reggie Calkins had appointed himself the building's unpaid, unelected authority on everything Dara Voss did wrong, a post he filled with real enthusiasm, and for absolutely no compensation. Woman's mama leaves her a super job on a silver platter, Reggie said one evening, loud enough to carry clean down the stairwell to the lobby, and she spends it building a landfill in the boiler room. He let that sit for the laugh and got it, a good one, and pushed a little further once he had the room. Her mama's rolling in her grave watching that. God rest her. The men leaning on the rail around him laughed the easy way people laugh at somebody who isn't there to hear it, and never will be. Nobody on that landing stopped to wonder whether the woman might have a reason. It was simpler to decide she didn't. A woman with a reason you have to take seriously. A fool you can talk about all winter and never owe a single thing. By the dead of winter, Dara's hands had gone raw from corroded battery terminals, cracked knuckles that split open at the first cold snap, and never fully closed before the next one opened them again. Skin gone thin and ashy, no matter how much salve she rubbed in before bed. But the boiler room kept filling, unit by unit, floor by floor. All the dead weight the building was so glad to be rid of piling up down there in the corner like it was worth something. Crate stacked on crate until the room started to smell faintly of old batteries and machine oil and the particular mustiness of things nobody wanted anymore. It was Marcus Alden 2 doors down who first got a real look at what she was doing with it. He came down one evening to drop off a dead space heater and found her wiring a stack of storm-cracked solar panels into a frame she'd welded herself. Out of scrap conduit, sparks flying dull orange in the dim light. He frowned at the whole business, the way any reasonable man would, and finally said if it's parts you need, he had a working inverter sitting in his hall closet doing nothing but taking up space. Brand new, barely used. Take it and welcome, no charge. Dara shook her head once and kept stripping wire with the same steady motion. Don't need the good ones, she said. Not sharp about it. Not unkind either, just final. The way she said most things. I need the ones already coming apart. Marcus stood there a long minute turning that sentence over in his head and finding no bottom in it at all, no way to make it mean anything sensible. He didn't understand it, and he was honest enough with himself not to pretend he did. So he watched his neighbor carry a milk crate of dead cells back into the dark of the boiler room and figured, the way the whole building figured, that grief does strange things to a person, and the kindest thing you could do was let it run its course and stay out of the way. What nobody in that building ever saw was the writing. Every night once the boiler room went quiet, and the last tenant had gone up to bed, Dara sat on the cold basement stairs under the one bare bulb and opened her mother's logbook and wrote in the empty pages that came after Renata's handwriting stopped. Which outlets browned out first on the third floor when the grid stumbled? Which stairwell held a trickle of charge 3 days after a flicker, and which one drained flat by morning? Which walls in the building ran a few degrees cooler than the rest? Where old copper still carried a current nobody living had reason to trust anymore. She was reading that building the way you'd reread a letter from somebody you'd lost and couldn't get back, slower every time, finding some new line in it she'd missed the first 4 readings. The building had been trying to tell her something the whole 14 months since her mother died. She'd only just gotten quiet enough and desperate enough to sit still long enough to hear the rest of the sentence. Down at the far end of the boiler room, in the space that used to hold nothing but a dead furnace nobody had bothered hauling out and a stack of paint cans gone solid with age, she started building 6 low steel racks, bolted floor to ceiling with brackets she'd scavenged from a construction dumpster 2 blocks over. She wired them in careful courses, dead cells sorted by hand and reconditioned one at a time and banked together in matched groups, buffer capacitors salvaged from the cracked solar panels bridging the gaps between them. The whole assembly run through a charge controller she'd built herself from parts nobody else in that building would have looked at twice, let alone known what to do with. From the doorway, it looked like nothing a person could put a name to. Some tangle of wire and scrap and old batteries that made no visual sense at all, or worse, in the dim yellow bulb light. Like a junk pile, a grieving woman had lost her mind arranging into rows for reasons only she understood. Somebody's building a bomb down there is what I'd worry about, Reggie announced one evening to anyone on the stoop who'd stand still long enough to hear it, and I don't personally care to find out which. He said it for the laugh and got a smaller one than usual, the room going a little quieter after. The old unease of not knowing what your strange neighbor is up to and the dark settling over the group like a draft. Nobody asked Dara straight out what any of it was for. It was easier to guess, and Dara offered nothing to correct the guessing. A woman who explains herself to people who've already made up their minds is only handing them more material to laugh about later. But the thing she was building did have a name. One not one single soul in that building had ever heard spoken aloud. One night alone on the basement stairs, the bulb turned down low to save what little charge the utility grid still owed the building. Dara paged the logbook back past her own handwriting, past her mother's, to the oldest pages tucked at the very front, brittle at the corners, and gone the color of weak tea themselves. The hand there wasn't her mother's either. It belonged to Solomon Reyes, the old electrician who'd trained Renata 30 years back before he retired to a fishing cabin nobody in the building had ever visited, and there, in his careful old-fashioned print, was a diagram he'd copied down decades earlier from a union pamphlet nobody read anymore. The kind of thing that gets photocopied once and passed hand to hand until the copies go soft and illegible and eventually just disappear. A shadow grid, he'd called it in the margin. A bank of low-voltage storage wired parallel behind a building's main panel, holding a trickle charge in reserve so the building never went fully dark. Not during a brownout. Not during a full blackout. Not ever. Not so long as the bank held its charge. Solomon had tried to build one once in a building across town in his younger days and gotten laughed off the job for it. An old man clinging to some backyard idea while the rest of the trade moved on to bigger transformers and smarter grids and equipment with warranties. Renata had believed him anyway. She'd written the whole diagram down herself in her own hand, meant to try it one day when she had the time and the money and the nerve. But believing a thing and doing it are 2 different animals entirely. And in Renata's years, the outages were still rare enough to simply wait out. So there was always next winter, always a reason to put it off one more season. Then next season ran out on her the way it does on everybody eventually, and the diagram just sat there in the logbook for 14 months, waiting on a daughter quiet enough and hurting enough to finally read it all the way through. The idea itself was simple enough to say in one breath, the way the best ideas usually are. Bank enough reclaimed storage behind a building's main line, and when the grid outside falters, the building doesn't notice for hours instead of minutes, sometimes doesn't notice at all if the outage is short enough. It needs no new transformer from a utility company that had already stopped returning calls about this block. It needs no favor from a management company that had already decided the building wasn't worth saving properly. It only needs time, patience measured in months instead of days, and every dead cell the building's own people were only ever too glad to be rid of. Dara didn't have money for a rewire, not a fraction of what the letter demanded. What she had was a boiler room nobody else wanted to spend time in, a set of hands split open at the knuckles from 3 months of corroded terminals, and every dead battery her neighbors handed over without once asking what it was for. For once in the long, unfair arithmetic of that building, the thing she needed most was the exact thing everybody else had already counted as worthless enough to throw away. There came a night in February, the coldest one that whole winter, when she bolted the last of the 6 racks into place and stood back in the dim room, breath fogging white in the cold that leaked down through the vents from the street above. She didn't feel triumphant. She wasn't built for triumph, and this wasn't the kind of night that offered any. She felt instead the way anyone feels when they've committed all the way to a thing they can no longer take back. The winter gone. The last of her savings gone into scrap and tools. The whole building's chance now hanging on a retired electrician's forgotten diagram and a hallway's worth of other people's discarded trash. She looked at the 6 racks standing quiet and dark against the far wall, and thought that if they held, the building held. If they held, then every dead cell down here, every laugh she'd swallowed on that 3rd floor landing, Solomon Reyes and the job he never got the chance to finish, her mother's 26 years, and the diagram she never got the nerve to try, every scrap of it would finally be worth something. It would mean none of them had wasted the years they'd spent believing it might work. If it didn't hold, she'd have proved every last one of them right, and done it herself with her own 2 hands. In the same basement her mother had walked for a quarter century. She closed the logbook, slid it back into her jacket over her heart, and climbed the stairs to her dark, empty apartment alone. There was no one up there waiting to hear how it went. She had no way of knowing that the whole bank would very nearly kill itself inside a single month. The first short came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks in. Corrosion she hadn't fully cleaned off a set of terminals arched against the rack frame sometime after midnight, and Dara woke to the smell of it seeping under her bedroom door before the smoke alarm even finished catching up, ran down 2 flights of stairs in her socks with her heart going hard enough to hurt, to find half of the first rack scorched black and dead. The reclaimed cells she'd spent 3 careful weeks reconditioning by hand melted down into a single ruined lump of plastic and metal that would never hold a charge again as long as it existed. She stood in the doorway of the boiler room a long while in the smoke-thin air and said not one word. And then Dara Voss did a thing she had not done, not once, not at the funeral, not at the graveside, not through any of the 14 long months since. She sat down right there on the cold concrete floor in front of the wreckage, and she did not move. It wasn't the rack itself. She could rebuild a rack. She'd already proven that to herself 100 times over that winter. It was everything the rack had been quietly holding up underneath its wiring, the plan, the whole winter of frozen mornings. The last thing Solomon Reyes had ever bothered to write down for anybody to find. The entire silent argument she was trying to win against a building and a management company and a whole set of neighbors who had already settled the matter without bothering to ask her opinion of it. She stayed there a long while, longer than she would ever have admitted to another living soul. Water she didn't remember starting running down her face and dripping onto the concrete between her knees. Then she wiped her face with the back of a scorched, still smoking hand, and she stood up. And she got to work. She rebuilt it, but not the same way twice. This time she isolated every rack behind its own dedicated breaker, so that a fault in one bank could never reach across and take down the next one alongside it. She ran every terminal through anti-corrosion paste and sealed connectors she'd ordered special and paid for out of money she didn't really have to spare. The way you build a thing meant to survive its own inevitable mistakes rather than pretend it won't make any. That night, still shaking a little on the basement stairs, she opened the logbook and wrote a single line underneath Solomon's careful old print: isolate every bank. Let one failure stay one failure and go no further. Then she closed the book, and she slept a few hours. And in the gray of the next morning she started in again from where the fire had stopped her. The short had been bad luck, the kind that could happen to anybody working with reclaimed parts in a damp basement. What came in March was harder to forgive, harder to explain away as simple chance. A heat spike from a faulty furnace pipe running along the same wall cooked the second rack's enclosure for 2 straight days before Dara even caught. The smell of warm plastic, swelling half the reclaimed cells until their casings cracked along the seams and the stored charge bled out of every one of them at once, hissing faintly in the dark like the room itself was exhaling. She found the damage on a Thursday morning on her way down for coffee and stood over it a long moment with her jaw set hard, her hands opening and closing at her sides in a slow, controlled rhythm. She didn't shout. Another person would have shouted, would have kicked the whole rack over and washed their hands of the entire foolish business before lunch. You could see it wanting to come out of her anyway, though. The anger banked down low and hot behind her ribs the way a stove holds its heat behind a shut iron door, visible only in the tightness of her jaw and the white showing across her knuckles where she'd made fists without quite deciding to. Then, after a moment, she crouched down without a word and started stripping the ruined cells out of their housings one at a time, methodical, unhurried on the outside no matter what was happening underneath. 2 full days that rack cost her, kneeling on cold concrete, testing every single cell by hand with the multimeter her mother had left behind, keeping what still held even a partial charge and scrapping the rest without sentiment, venting the new enclosure properly this time with a salvaged fan pulled from a dead furnace nobody upstairs had wanted to pay to have hauled away. Reggie leaned into the boiler room doorway on the second afternoon, drawn down by the smell of scorched plastic drifting up the stairwell, and grinned at the mess spread across the floor. "Heat took your little science project, huh?" he said. Not unkindly exactly, just with the easy cruelty of a man enjoying being right about something. "Maybe that's the building telling you something, Dara. Ever think of that?" Dara didn't so much as glance up from the cell she was testing. She set it back into its slot and pressed the terminal home with her thumb, checked the reading, moved to the next one. After a moment, getting nothing further out of her, Reggie shrugged and moved on back down the hall to wherever he'd come from. The building took her silence in the days that followed for surrender, a woman finally run clean out of ideas and too proud to admit it. They had it exactly backward. Outside, she was stone. The only place the 2 versions of her ever met at all was the logbook, and nobody in that whole building ever once read the logbook but her. The third rack, it wasn't fire, and it wasn't heat that got it. It was mice, small and ordinary and utterly without malice, chewing half the connections between a dozen cells down to bare copper sometime over the course of one quiet night, doing nothing more sinister than the plain honest business of being mice looking for somewhere warm and dry to nest. But the exposed wire sat there the next morning regardless, one bad short away from taking the whole bank down the same way the first fire had. Dara looked at it a long moment, let out one slow breath through her nose that fogged faintly in the cold basement air, and said nothing at all. She was too worn down by then to be properly astonished by anything, and too worn down even to be angry the way she had been over the heat spike. What she had left, when she took stock of herself standing there, was simply the will to solve the next problem sitting directly in front of her. So she solved it, running every exposed line through scrap conduit pulled from panels she hadn't yet stripped down for parts, sealing every joint against future teeth, turning the very metal she'd salvaged for one purpose into armor for the wiring it now protected. There was a grim kind of symmetry in that, using the building's own scrap to guard the building's own salvage, and if Dara noticed it, she kept the observation to herself same as she kept most things. And that gray, ordinary morning turned out to be the morning something shifted, small but unmistakably real. Marcus Alden, coming down to check his own breaker box after a flicker in his kitchen lights the night before, slowed at the sight of her sealing scrap conduit around a wall of scavenged batteries with the patient. Unhurried care of someone building something meant to last. And for the first time in all those months, he didn't think grief does strange things to a person and leave it there. He thought, instead, standing in that doorway with his coffee going cold in his hand, what does she know that I don't? It wasn't belief yet. It was a long way still from belief. But it was the first real crack of sustained attention in a building that had made up its collective mind back in the fall, that there was nothing happening in that basement worth a second glance from anybody with better things to do. It was Reggie himself who came down a few days after that, and not to laugh this time, which surprised her more than she let show on her face. He stood in the boiler room doorway with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets and looked the whole scorched, rewired, half-finished bank over slowly. The way a man looks over a horse he's already privately decided is lame but is willing, out of some leftover courtesy, to consider one more time before writing it off for good. Rough winter, he said finally, and he didn't say it unkind, which was somehow worse coming from him than the mockery had ever been. He let that sit a moment in the cold air between them, then told her the management company was quietly offering early movers a bit of cash to relocate without fuss, before the promised power cuts started for real and things got ugly for whoever was still holding a lease when they did. Enough, he said, to cover first and last on a place with wiring from this century, instead of the last one. And here's the part Dara never told a single living soul, not Marcus, not anyone. For one long moment, standing there with both hands wrapped in bloody gauze, 2 ruined racks rebuilt behind her and a third patched together with scavenged conduit. Tired all the way down to some bones she hadn't known she had, she actually thought about it. All she had to do was nod once, and it would all be over. The cold mornings, the corroded terminals, the landing full of men who'd already decided what kind of woman she was. She didn't nod. She reached up instead and touched the logbook through the fabric of her jacket, the way another person might touch an old scar they'd stopped noticing years ago. And she shook her head once, slow and final. "Not going anywhere," she said. Reggie looked at her a second longer, like he was waiting for the sentence to grow a second half that never came, then shrugged the particular shrug of a man who'd tried a small kindness and gotten no thanks for the trouble, and climbed back up the stairs to whatever was waiting for him on the 3rd floor. It was near the very end of that winter when the utility contractor came through. A tired-looking man doing routine line checks up and down the block ahead of the spring maintenance schedule, meaning only to knock, note the meter reading, and move on to the next building on his list before lunch. He stepped into the boiler room to check the main panel out of pure procedural habit and stopped dead, one boot still half over the threshold, at the sight of 6 racks of bank cells wired in careful, deliberate parallel behind it, cables run clean and labeled in a hand he didn't recognize but immediately trusted. He walked the length of the setup slowly, saying nothing at all for a long stretch. The way a person walks past something they half recognize from somewhere else entirely and can't quite place. A name sitting right on the tip of the tongue and refusing to come. Then he turned and asked her straight out, no preamble, whether she'd learned this out of some manual or trade course he wasn't aware of. Dara shook her head once. No manual, she said, and looked back down the row of quietly humming racks before she went on, her voice dropping lower than its usual flat register, something underneath it she didn't often let show in front of strangers. From an old man's notes, she said, passed down through somebody who never got the chance to try it himself. The contractor didn't laugh, and that, more than almost anything else he said or did that afternoon, was what Dara would go on remembering. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and looked down the length of the setup one more time, slower this time, like he was recalculating something. He told her he'd seen something close to this once before, a few years back. A building across the river that had come through a full 3-day outage while every other block around it sat dark and freezing for the duration. And nobody could rightly say how they'd managed it until you got up close and saw exactly what somebody had gone and wired in behind that building's main panel, quiet and unglamorous and entirely unofficial. It was the first time in all those long months that a voice from somewhere outside Dara's own head had told her plainly that she hadn't lost her mind, chasing a dead man's forgotten diagram through a winter of failures, that the thing actually worked, that somebody, somewhere, had already lived long enough to prove it. The contractor left without writing her up for a single code violation, which she understood, without either of them saying so out loud, was its own kind of blessing. That night Dara sat with the logbook open on her knee a long while before she wrote anything down in it at all. Once the racks finally held steady, once the shorts stopped arsing and the heat stopped cooking the enclosures and the mice gave up chewing on wire that fought back with a layer of steel around it, Dara tied the whole bank into the building's main line through a controller no bigger than a kitchen toaster, set to catch the load the instant the street grid so much as stumbled. Through that whole spring, nothing happened one way or the other to prove any of it out. The lights stayed on the ordinary way because the grid outside the building stayed steady the ordinary way. And a steady grid gives a person nothing at all to point at and call proof of anything. She kept the logbook regardless, checking the charge levels most evenings the way she'd once checked her mother's face for the smallest sign that the day's exhaustion was finally starting to ease. Nothing turned that spring, not really. The bank simply sat there behind its panel, holding its slow trickle charge, giving her nothing more to go on than the plain, unremarkable fact that it hadn't yet failed her. She wrote that down too, one quiet evening in April. Still holding. That was the whole of the report, 4 words on an otherwise empty page. It was the January storm, almost a full year after she'd started, that came for all of them at once. The worst ice the block had seen in a decade by every account, thick enough to snap power lines 2 full streets over under its own weight. And the whole grid serving that entire side of the city buckled under the strain of it, and went down for 3 straight days running. Every building up and down the block went dark within the first 2 hours. Dark stairwells, dark hallways, refrigerators failing one after another in the growing cold, families huddled together under every blanket they owned waiting out a utility company that kept pushing its estimated restoration time further back with each new update. And by every reasonable measure a sensible person could name. A boiler room full of second-hand batteries wired together over the course of one exhausting year by a single woman with permanently scarred knuckles should have lasted about as long as anybody's phone flashlight before giving out same as everything else on that street. It was Marcus Alden who noticed it first. He was heading down through the stairwell to his own dark, rapidly cooling unit to check on his kids by the light of a dying phone flashlight when he saw warm, steady light spilling out from under the boiler room door at the bottom of the stairs, the hallway bulb still lit. The elevator call panel still glowing faintly at the far end. The whole building humming quietly along like the storm tearing through the streets outside was somebody else's entire problem to solve. He stood there in the hallway a long moment, one hand pressed flat against a wall that was, impossibly, still warm to the touch. Before he went and found Dara down in the boiler room checking connections one at a time by the light of her own battery-powered work lamp, calm as anything, like this was simply Tuesday. All he could manage to get out was a single word, and it didn't come out fully as a question even though it clearly meant to be one. How? Dara didn't answer right away. She finished checking the terminal in front of her, looked slowly down the row of quietly humming racks, and only then looked back at him. Those old batteries everybody threw out, she said finally. They weren't garbage sitting in that rack, Marcus. Their charge was just waiting on somebody to finally ask for it. Marcus didn't understand all of it that night. Not even half of it if he was honest with himself. But he came back down the next morning anyway to ask more questions. And the morning after that, and somewhere in the course of that long, freezing week, he quietly quit pretending he was only ever passing through on his way to somewhere else. Word moves slow in a building full of people mostly minding their own business, and slower still when a man's pride has got a hand somewhere in the moving of it. But it took the better part of that 3-day storm for the talk to turn all the way around, from strange to lucky. As if luck alone could account for a basement full of somebody else's trash outlasting a full grid failure that had taken down blocks 3 and 4, times the size of theirs. It wasn't luck, and Dara had never once believed it was, not for a single cold night of that entire long year. And by the end of that week, so did anybody in the building honest enough to stand in a warm hallway during a blackout and admit what they were feeling. It had cost one whole winter of gathering up other people's dead weight in the freezing cold. It had cost 2 entire racks rebuilt from scratch by hand, on a concrete floor, in the aftermath of fire and heat damage, with knuckles that split open fresh every time they'd just started to heal. It had cost a plain, stubborn willingness to be laughed at on landings and stoops and in laundry rooms for exactly as long as it was going to take to finally be proven right. And there was one more thing that Storm gave her, a thing Dara noticed quietly before anybody else in the building did, standing alone in the basement on the second night of the outage. The building's old original wiring. The wiring her mother had patched and repatched by hand across 26 years of quiet, unglamorous work. Wiring the whole building had privately written off months earlier as one hard winter away from total failure. Held steady clean through all 3 days of the storm, carrying the shadow grid's current out into corners of the building even Dara herself hadn't specifically planned for, corners her mother had known intimately by feel decades ago, and simply never gotten the money or the time to properly finish repairing before she died. Dara stood in the basement that third night with her mother's old patched lines, and her own newly banked cells, both humming the very same current, through the same old walls. And she didn't say a single word out loud to anyone. She simply took the logbook out of her jacket pocket and wrote the date at the top of a clean page, and underneath it, 3 words and nothing else. It's holding both. The building didn't transform overnight, not really. Not in any way you could point a finger at and call decisive. Real things almost never do come that way. It came instead the slow, quiet way real things usually come. One small, unremarkable thing at a time, until one gray Tuesday afternoon in late January, when the management company's inspection crew showed up expecting to post yet another notice on the lobby bulletin board, and instead found all 41 units still running on power nobody in their paperwork could readily explain away. You could see the crew's genuine confusion from clear out on the sidewalk, clipboards out, heads together. One of them going back out to his van twice to double-check something on a laptop. You could see the same confusion echo all the way up to the 3rd-floor landing where the laughing had first started nearly a full year before. Nobody was laughing on that landing anymore. Reggie stood at the rail that afternoon and looked down at a building that hadn't gone dark once through the entire ordeal. The very same building he'd once stood on that same landing and told her, with real confidence, would be sold out from under her well before spring arrived. He didn't have a single smart thing left to say about any of it. For maybe the first time in his entire talking life, Reggie Calkins simply watched and kept his mouth shut. People started coming down to the boiler room with genuine questions after that, hats in hand as the old saying goes, though nobody in that building particularly wore hats anymore, asking the still, quiet woman down in the basement whether she still needed dead batteries, or whether she might show a person how to wire up a rack of their own if they brought her the parts. She said yes to every single bit of it. Every last request, because she had never once been in the business of turning down somebody who'd finally decided they wanted to learn something. The building never did get its full, expensive rewire, the kind the original letter had threatened them all with, because the follow-up inspection that came after the storm came back entirely clean on account of a shadow grid nobody at the management company had known existed until the crew's own engineer walked the boiler room and couldn't find a single thing wrong with it worth writing up. The eviction letters that half the building had been quietly bracing for never got sent out after all. The building simply stood. The particular way a building stands when the people actually living inside it have collectively decided it's worth standing for a while longer. There was a girl who lived on the 2nd floor, 10 years old, who started coming down to the boiler room more often than anybody else that spring, full of exactly the questions the grown men upstairs were still too proud to ask out loud even now that they'd all quietly come around. She wanted to know how a dead battery could possibly know the difference between when to give its charge back to the building and when to hold on to it a little longer, patient in the dark. Dara didn't laugh at her. A small kindness the men on that landing had never once managed to extend to her across the whole hard year. And she wasn't about to hand that particular cruelty back to a child who genuinely didn't know any better yet. She crouched down beside the rack instead, took the girl's small hand gently in her own scarred one, and pressed her palm flat against the warm casing of a working cell, let her feel it humming there beneath her fingers, real and steady and alive, in a building that 3 straight days of ice had tried its level best to put out for good. Then Dara reached into her jacket and brought out the logbook, soft now at every corner, and opened it carefully to Solomon Reyes's old, careful print near the very front. A man wrote this down a long time ago, she told the girl quietly, turning the brittle pages slow so she could see each one. And the whole building he lived in called him a fool for it, his entire life, right up until the day he retired and moved on. She stopped turning pages at the spot where Solomon's careful old print gave way at last to her mother's familiar slanted hand. They were wrong about him, she said. You remember that, whatever anybody ever tells you later. The girl nodded the particular way a child nods at something she doesn't yet fully understand but has already decided to carry with her regardless, to turn over slowly in her own mind for years and grow into eventually. Dara figured that was about right, about as close to the truth of the thing as words could get. That was, after all, more or less how the whole business had come down to her too in the end. One person's nearly forgotten notes handed on and very nearly lost somewhere in the handing, now handed on again. One battery rack and one small warm palm at a time, down through whichever child in the building turned out to be quiet enough to listen properly. By that second full spring, word of the shadow grid had traveled well past Meridian Fields itself. Out to buildings 3 and 4 blocks over where supers Dara had never formally met came around asking careful questions and leaving with careful answers and, more than a few times, a milk crate of her own reconditioned cells to get them started. But what people in that particular building remembered afterward, in the years that eventually followed all of it, wasn't really the grid itself in the end. Grids get old the same as anything else, and eventually get replaced with better, newer, more official ones soon enough, regardless of who built the first version out of scrap and stubbornness. What people remembered instead was the woman who'd had every reasonable excuse under the sun to simply take the money on offer and go, and who had instead spent one entire brutal winter gathering up everything the rest of them had been only too glad to throw away. Patient through every failure, laughed at through every setback, waiting the whole time for it to finally matter to somebody besides herself. She never once said "I told you so," not to Reggie, not to the management company, not to a single soul in that entire building. No matter how badly some of them might privately have deserved to hear it, she never had to say it out loud even once. The light said it for her. Every single time the grid outside that building stumbled in a storm, and Meridian Fields, alone on its block, didn't so much as flicker in response. And somewhere behind that basement panel, tucked away in the dark where no eye would ever think to follow, sat the very same dead cells the whole building had once been only too glad to be rid of, quietly holding their slow trickle charge, quietly doing the exact same thing, year after year, that she had always known in her bones they would eventually do if somebody was only patient enough to let them. Turns out the real difference between waste and worth was never actually located in the batteries at all, not in any of them, not really. It was only ever located in whoever happened to be patient enough to wait around for what they'd eventually become, given enough time and enough belief and enough willingness to fail in front of people who were watching closely for exactly that. Dara Voss spent one whole brutal winter being quietly laughed at for collecting the very thing that ended up saving her entire building from the inside out. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, sitting here thinking it over, how much of what you yourself have thrown away, or written off, or simply counted as finished and done with, was only ever waiting on a little more patience from you than you were willing to give it at the time. So tell us down in the comments tonight, honestly, if there's something like that sitting in your own life right now. Something the world around you called worthless that you went ahead and held on to anyway. We read every single one of them, every comment, every story. And if this one moved you even a little bit tonight, do the small thing that helps it find the next person who needs to hear it. Give it a like, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. We're genuinely glad you stayed with us all the way to the very end tonight. Take care of yourself out there, and we'll see you again in the next one.